The smell still lingers in the abandoned boarding house on Elm Creek Road, 3 miles south of what used to be Deadwood Gulch. Local historians claim it's just rotting wood and decades of neglect, but the few visitors who ventured inside describe something else entirely, something sweet and nauseating that clings to your clothes long after you leave. In 1854, this same building housed 43 miners during the Dakota Gold Rush. By winter's end, 36 had fled the territory, claiming they'd rather starve than eat another meal prepared by the boarding house cook. The official records show 7 men died of various illnesses that year, all married to the same woman within 12 months. What those records don't mention is why the massive iron cooking pot in the kitchen was buried 6 feet underground behind the building, or why Martha Sinclair's recipe book disappeared from the county courthouse the same night she vanished. Before we continue with the story of Martha Sinclair and the darkest chapter in Deadwood Gulch's history, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more chilling tales from America's forgotten past, and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. These stories happened everywhere. The truth about what happened in that boarding house kitchen would remain buried for over a century, until a construction crew unearthed something that made even the coroner refuse to file an official report. Deadwood Gulch wasn't like the famous Deadwood that would later capture America's imagination. This was a smaller, more desperate place, a collection of hastily built structures clinging to the sides of a narrow valley where Elm Creek carved its way through the Dakota Territory. In the spring of 1854, when gold flakes were first discovered in the creek bed, the population swelled from 12 families to over 200 fortune seekers within 6 weeks. The settlement had no law, no doctor, and precious little hope. Most miners lived in canvas tents or crude dugouts carved into the hillsides. The few wooden buildings that existed charged exorbitant prices for everything from a cup of coffee to a dry place to sleep. It was into this chaos that Martha Sinclair arrived on a wagon train from Independence, Missouri, carrying nothing but a leather satchel, a massive iron cooking pot that required 4 men to lift, and a letter of introduction from a deceased husband she claimed had died of consumption. Martha was 34 years old, with prematurely gray hair and hands that bore the permanent stains of a woman who had spent her life working with fire and metal. She had a peculiar way of looking at people, not quite meeting their eyes, but staring somewhere around their collarbone, as if she were measuring something only she could see. Within a week of her arrival, she had negotiated the purchase of the largest building in the Gulch, a 2-story structure that had been abandoned when its previous owner died in a mining accident. The building sat at the intersection of what passed for the main street and the path that led up to the richest claims. It was perfectly positioned to catch every miner coming and going from their work. Martha immediately set about converting it into a boarding house, installing her enormous cooking pot in the kitchen and posting handwritten signs throughout the settlement. Clean beds, hot meals, fair prices. No credit, no exceptions. The boarding house filled quickly. In a place where most meals consisted of hardtack and beans cooked over an open fire, Martha's kitchen produced genuine feasts. Her stews were thick with meat and vegetables, her bread was soft and warm, and she somehow managed to serve fresh eggs and milk despite the nearest farm being over 100 miles away. The miners talked constantly about the quality of her cooking, particularly the rich, complex flavor of her meat stews that seemed unlike anything they had tasted before. Thomas Brennigan was the first to notice something unusual about their landlady. He had worked as a butcher in St. Louis before catching gold fever, and he had questions about the meat Martha served. The texture was different from beef or pork, more tender, with a grain that reminded him of something else entirely. When he asked Martha where she sourced her meat, she smiled that peculiar smile of hers and told him about a Lakota woman who traded with her, bringing deer and elk from the deep woods in exchange for flour and sugar. But Thomas had hunted deer and elk. This wasn't either of those. Samuel Fletcher arrived at the boarding house on a Tuesday in late April, carrying a leather pouch that clinked softly when he walked. He was a big man, nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and hands the size of dinner plates. He had struck a small but promising vein in his claim and needed a place to stay while he worked it properly. More importantly, he needed a place to keep his gold safe while he accumulated enough to make the journey back to his family in Ohio worthwhile. Martha took particular interest in Samuel from the moment he signed her guest register. She made sure his meals were especially generous, that his coffee was always hot, and that his room, the best one in the house, was kept immaculately clean. She asked thoughtful questions about his mining techniques, his family back home, and his plans for the future. Samuel, who had been living alone in a tent for 3 months, was grateful for the attention and conversation. Within 2 weeks, their relationship had progressed beyond landlady and tenant. Samuel began staying after dinner to help Martha with the dishes, and their conversation stretched late into the evening. She was intelligent and well-read, with strong opinions about politics and philosophy that surprised him. She had traveled extensively before coming to Dakota Territory, she said, and had learned cooking techniques from various immigrant communities throughout the Midwest. The other boarders began to notice the special attention Samuel received. His portions at dinner were larger, his coffee stronger, and Martha always seemed to have fresh baked goods available whenever he appeared in the kitchen. Some of the men grumbled about favoritism, but most were simply grateful that Martha's good mood seemed to improve the quality of everyone's meals. On May 15th, exactly 1 month after Samuel's arrival, Martha announced to the boarding house that they would be married the following Sunday. The ceremony would be simple, performed by circuit preacher Williams, who passed through the territory every few weeks, and followed by a feast for all the boarders. Samuel seemed somewhat overwhelmed by the speed of the courtship, but he was genuinely fond of Martha and appreciated her practical approach to their situation. In a place like Deadwood Gulch, conventional courtship was a luxury few could afford. The wedding feast was memorable for reasons that would only become clear much later. Martha served a stew so rich and flavorful that men still talked about it weeks afterward. The meat was incredibly tender, seasoned with herbs that none of them could identify, and there was enough for everyone to have second and third helpings. Several boarders claimed it was the best meal they had ever eaten, and more than one suggested that Martha should write down her recipes before some other boarding house stole her techniques. Samuel Fletcher died on a Wednesday morning in early June, 3 weeks after his wedding. He had complained of stomach pains and fever for 2 days before his condition worsened rapidly. Dr. Ephraim Mills, who served 3 mining camps in the area and was known more for his availability than his skill, diagnosed it as dysentery complicated by exhaustion. It was a common enough cause of death in the mining camps, where sanitation was poor and medical care was virtually non-existent. Martha was devastated by her husband's death, or at least appeared to be. She spent 2 days in her room, refusing to cook or speak to anyone. When she finally emerged, she was wearing black clothing that she had somehow acquired, and she moved through the boarding house like a woman carrying the weight of genuine grief. The other boarders did their best to console her, bringing her small gifts and offering to help with the heavier work around the building. Samuel's body was buried in the small cemetery that had been established on a hill overlooking the gulch. The service was attended by nearly everyone in the settlement, a testament to how well-liked he had been during his brief time there. Martha stood at the graveside, dry-eyed but pale, clutching a handkerchief that never seemed to be used. What none of the mourners knew was that Samuel's body was not in the coffin they lowered into the ground. That coffin contained rocks and dirt, while Samuel himself had been carefully butchered in Martha's kitchen the night after his death. Every usable piece of meat had been preserved with salt and stored in the root cellar beneath the boarding house. The massive iron pot had been thoroughly cleaned and seasoned afterward, ready for its next use. The boarding house resumed normal operations within a week of the funeral. Martha's cooking was as excellent as ever, though she seemed to favor stews and braised dishes over the roasted meats she had served during Samuel's lifetime. The boarders attributed this to her grief. Perhaps preparing roasts reminded her too much of the meals she had shared with her late husband. Heinrich Stoltz arrived from Wisconsin in mid-June, drawn by reports of easy gold and steady work. He was a skilled blacksmith who had grown tired of farming and saw an opportunity to make real money providing metalwork services to the mining community. Unlike Samuel, who had been focused on finding gold, Heinrich was interested in building a permanent business in Deadwood Gulch. He rented space behind the boarding house for his forge and quickly established himself as an essential member of the community. Martha's interest in Heinrich seemed natural enough. A blacksmith was exactly the kind of stable, skilled tradesman that a widow running a business would want to associate with. Heinrich could repair the tools and equipment that kept the boarding house running, and his steady income from metalwork made him a desirable tenant and potential husband. Their courtship followed a pattern similar to her relationship with Samuel, but compressed into an even shorter time frame. Martha made sure Heinrich's meals were exceptional, that his room was perfectly maintained, and that she was always available to discuss his business plans and dreams for the future. Heinrich, who had been living alone since his wife died in childbirth 2 years earlier, was grateful for Martha's attention and impressed by her business acumen. They were married on July 4th, in a ceremony that doubled as a holiday celebration for the entire settlement. Martha prepared an Independence Day feast that was talked about for months afterward. The centerpiece was a massive stew that seemed to contain every type of meat imaginable, seasoned with spices that created flavors none of the miners had experienced before. The bread was fresher than anything they had tasted since leaving civilization, and there were vegetables that shouldn't have been available in the Dakota Territory in July. Heinrich died on July 28th, 3 weeks and 3 days after his wedding. Like Samuel, he had complained of stomach problems and fever before his condition deteriorated rapidly. Dr. Mills diagnosed it as a combination of heat exhaustion and food poisoning, suggesting that Heinrich's Germanic constitution wasn't suited to the harsh conditions of the territory. The pattern of Martha's grief was identical to what the boarders had observed after Samuel's death. 2 days of seclusion, followed by a gradual return to her duties, wearing black clothing and moving with the measured dignity of a woman who had lost everything twice in 3 months. The other residents of the boarding house were genuinely sympathetic. Losing 2 husbands in such a short period seemed like a cruel twist of fate, even in a place where death was a constant presence. Heinrich's funeral was held on a Saturday morning, with his coffin displayed in the boarding house's main room before being carried to the cemetery. Martha had prepared his body herself, she explained, as was proper for a wife to do. She had learned the techniques from her grandmother, who had performed the same service for their family in Missouri. The boarders were impressed by her dedication and her knowledge of funeral customs. What they didn't know was that Heinrich, like Samuel before him, was not in the coffin they buried. His body had been processed in Martha's kitchen with the efficiency of a professional butcher, every usable portion preserved and stored. The massive iron pot had been used again, seasoned with Heinrich's blood and fat, until it developed an even richer patina. By August, a few of the more observant boarders were beginning to notice certain patterns. Martha's cooking had become even more exceptional after Heinrich's death, with stews that had layers of flavor that seemed almost impossible to achieve. The meat was consistently tender and well marbled, with a richness that spoke of excellent breeding and careful aging. Yet no one could explain where Martha was sourcing such high-quality ingredients in the middle of the Dakota Territory. Thomas Brennigan, the former butcher, was becoming increasingly suspicious. He had tried to engage Martha in conversations about her meat suppliers, but she always deflected his questions with vague answers about trading relationships and seasonal availability. More troubling was his growing certainty that the meat in Martha's stews was neither beef, pork, venison, nor any other animal he could identify. James Crawford came to Deadwood Gulch in mid-August, fleeing debts and bad decisions in Kansas City. He was a charming man with an easy smile and a gift for making people feel comfortable, skills that served him well in the cramped quarters of the boarding house. Unlike Samuel and Heinrich, who had been serious men focused on work and building futures, James was entertaining company who could play cards, tell stories, and keep the other boarders laughing during the long evenings. Martha's attraction to James seemed different from her previous relationships. Where she had been practical and measured with Samuel and Heinrich, she appeared genuinely charmed by James's wit and personality. Their courtship was more romantic, with long walks along the creek in the evenings and private conversations that stretched until dawn. The other boarders noticed that Martha seemed younger and more animated when James was around, laughing at his jokes and blushing at his compliments. They were married on September 2nd, after a courtship that lasted exactly 2 weeks. The wedding feast featured Martha's now famous stew, but this time she had added new ingredients that created an even more complex flavor profile. Several boarders commented that the meat seemed to have multiple textures, as if different cuts from different animals had been combined in a way that complemented each other perfectly. James Crawford died on September 21st, following the same pattern of stomach illness and fever that had claimed his predecessors. Dr. Mills was beginning to notice the pattern as well, but attributed it to the poor sanitation conditions in the boarding house rather than any more sinister cause. He recommended that Martha improve her food storage and preparation methods, suggestions that she accepted graciously while privately dismissing. The fourth marriage followed so quickly that even the most trusting boarders began to murmur about impropriety. William O'Brien arrived on October 1st, an Irish immigrant with a strong back and a willingness to work the most dangerous claims in exchange for higher shares of any gold discovered. Martha began showing interest in him within days of his arrival, and they were married on October 15th, less than a month after James Crawford's funeral. William's death on November 8th was accompanied by new details that made some boarders uncomfortable. He had been heard arguing with Martha the night before he fell ill, though no one could make out the specific words through the thin walls. Thomas Brennigan reported that he had seen Martha leaving the boarding house very early in the morning carrying a large bundle wrapped in canvas, returning several hours later without it. More troubling was the discovery that William's personal effects, including a substantial amount of gold dust he had accumulated, had disappeared along with his body. When questioned, Martha explained that William had asked her to forward his belongings to his family in Boston, and that she had already sent them by wagon train. The explanation was plausible enough, but it raised questions about why the other dead husband's possessions had apparently been handled differently. By November, Thomas Brennigan's suspicions had evolved into genuine concern. As the only boarder with professional experience in meat processing, he was uniquely qualified to recognize that something was fundamentally wrong with Martha's cooking. The texture, flavor, and appearance of her meat dishes were consistent with one specific type of protein, one that no legitimate supplier would be providing to a boarding house in the Dakota Territory. Thomas began keeping a journal, documenting everything he observed about Martha's cooking methods, ingredient storage, and the timing of various events. He noted that the quality of her stews improved dramatically immediately after each husband's death, as if she had suddenly gained access to premium ingredients. He also observed that Martha seemed to have detailed knowledge of butchering and food preservation techniques that went far beyond what most women would learn in domestic settings. More disturbing was his growing certainty about the source of Martha's meat. He had worked with human bodies during his time in St. Louis, preparing them for medical schools when the official suppliers couldn't meet demand. The texture and grain of properly prepared human flesh was distinctive, and it matched what he had been eating for months at Martha's table. On November 15th, Thomas made a decision that would have horrified him under normal circumstances. He broke into Martha's root cellar while she was visiting the cemetery, determined to find proof of what he suspected. What he discovered there exceeded his worst fears, and convinced him that immediate action was necessary. The root cellar contained the preserved remains of at least 4 different bodies, carefully butchered and stored with professional expertise. Each cut was labeled with Martha's careful handwriting, indicating which part of which animal it had come from and when it had been processed. There were detailed notes about aging times, seasoning techniques, and cooking methods that read like a cookbook written by someone with extensive experience preparing human flesh. More horrifying was a separate journal that documented Martha's marriages and the subsequent processing of her husband's bodies. Each entry contained detailed descriptions of their physical condition, weight, and the yield of usable meat their bodies had provided. There were notes about which cuts were best for specific dishes, how long different parts needed to age for optimal flavor, and recipes that had been refined through trial and error. Thomas also discovered a collection of personal effects that had belonged to Martha's dead husbands: wedding rings, pocket watches, gold nuggets, and documents that should have been sent to their families. Everything had been carefully catalogued and stored, suggesting that Martha was keeping trophies from each of her victims. Despite Thomas's growing certainty about Martha's crimes, he faced an impossible situation. He had no legal authority in Deadwood Gulch, no way to contact outside law enforcement, and no assurance that anyone would believe his accusations. More importantly, he realized that confronting Martha directly would likely result in his own death, adding him to the collection of preserved meat in her root cellar. Instead, Thomas decided to gather more evidence while trying to protect future victims. When Daniel Kowalski arrived in late November, a Polish immigrant with limited English and no local connections, Thomas tried to warn him about Martha's history. But Daniel, who had been living in a tent through the increasingly cold nights, was grateful for the warmth and comfort of the boarding house and dismissed Thomas's concerns as jealousy or prejudice. Martha's courtship of Daniel followed the established pattern, but with new refinements that suggested she was perfecting her technique. She took advantage of Daniel's limited English to control their conversations, presenting herself as his protector and guide in navigating American customs. Their marriage on December 8th was celebrated with another elaborate feast, this one featuring what Martha described as a traditional Polish dish that honored Daniel's heritage. Daniel Kowalski died on December 27th, but his death was different from the others. Instead of the gradual illness that had characterized previous deaths, Daniel simply didn't wake up one morning. Dr. Mills, who was becoming increasingly suspicious of the pattern of deaths at the boarding house, requested permission to examine the body more carefully. Martha refused, citing religious concerns about disturbing the dead, and had Daniel buried before the doctor could insist. The sixth marriage was the most troubling yet. Robert Chen was a Chinese immigrant who had been working as a cook for one of the larger mining operations before arriving at Martha's boarding house in early January 1855. His knowledge of cooking techniques and ingredient preparation made him both valuable and dangerous to Martha's operations. Thomas watched in horror as Martha began her familiar courtship pattern with Robert, knowing that he was witnessing the methodical selection of another victim. He made several attempts to warn Robert, but cultural and language barriers made communication difficult. More frustrating was Robert's obvious admiration for Martha's cooking skills and his eagerness to learn her techniques. They were married on January 23rd, and Robert Chen died on February 14th. His death was particularly suspicious because Robert had been in excellent health and had actually been helping Martha with food preparation in the days before his illness began. Thomas realized that Martha was becoming bolder and more careless, perhaps confident that no one would challenge her or that she could eliminate any threats to her operation. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Deadwood Gulch intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Martha's terrifying reign of culinary murder. Peter Larsen arrived at the boarding house on February 20th, a Norwegian immigrant whose imposing physical presence and suspicious nature made him different from Martha's previous victims. Standing nearly 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders broadened by years of military service and manual labor, Peter carried himself with the alert posture of a man who had survived dangerous situations by staying vigilant. His pale blue eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of his surroundings, and he had the unsettling habit of asking follow-up questions when most people would have accepted simple answers. Unlike the other men who had come to Deadwood Gulch seeking quick fortunes, Peter arrived with a different purpose. He had been hired by a mining consortium in Chicago to investigate reports of unusual activity in various frontier settlements. disappearances, suspicious deaths, and financial irregularities that might indicate fraud or worse. His military background and experience with criminal investigations made him ideally suited for work that required discretion and the ability to operate without official authority. Martha's first encounter with Peter was telling in ways that would only become clear later. When he signed the guest register, she studied his handwriting with unusual intensity, noting the precise formation of his letters and the steady hand that suggested both education and self-control. She asked the standard questions about his background and plans, but Peter's answers were vague enough to frustrate her attempts to categorize him as easily as she had his predecessors. More troubling for Martha was Peter's immediate interest in the boarding house's history. He asked specific questions about previous tenants, their length of stay, and the circumstances of their departures. When Martha tried to deflect these inquiries with general comments about the transient nature of mining communities, Peter pressed for details that revealed an uncomfortable familiarity with investigative techniques. During his first dinner at the boarding house, Peter's reaction to Martha's famous stew was markedly different from that of other newcomers. While the other boarders praised the rich flavor and tender meat, Peter ate slowly and thoughtfully, occasionally pausing to examine individual pieces with the attention of someone analyzing rather than simply enjoying his meal. His compliments to Martha were polite but restrained, lacking the enthusiasm that usually encouraged her to share details about her cooking methods. Martha's approach to Peter was more cautious than with her earlier husbands. She seemed to recognize that he posed a greater threat than the others and adjusted her strategy accordingly. Instead of the rapid courtship that had characterized her previous relationships, she took time to study Peter's habits and weaknesses, looking for the best way to gain his trust and eventually his life. But Peter was also studying Martha. His military training had taught him to recognize when someone was evaluating him as a potential target, and he quickly identified the predatory calculation behind Martha's seemingly innocent questions about his financial situation, family connections, and future plans. The fact that she was asking these questions at all, rather than simply providing hospitality to a paying customer, raised immediate red flags. Peter began his own investigation within days of his arrival. He made casual inquiries about Martha's previous husbands, presenting himself as someone interested in the romantic history of the boarding house. The responses he received painted an increasingly disturbing picture of a pattern that seemed too consistent to be coincidental. 7 men in less than a year, all healthy and financially secure when they arrived, all dead within weeks of marrying the landlady. The other boarders' descriptions of the deaths were particularly troubling. Each man had supposedly succumbed to common frontier ailments, dysentery, fever, food poisoning, heat exhaustion, but the symptoms they described didn't quite match Peter's knowledge of these conditions. More suspicious was the rapid progression from mild illness to death, and the fact that Martha had handled all the funeral arrangements herself, discouraging outside involvement in the preparation and burial of the bodies. Thomas Brennigan saw an opportunity in Peter's arrival. Here was someone with the experience and temperament to potentially confront Martha's crimes. But approaching Peter required careful planning. Thomas had lived with his suspicions for months, knowing that any direct accusation against Martha would likely result in his own death. He needed to share his knowledge without appearing to be the one making the initial accusations. The opportunity came during a late-night card game in the boarding house's main room. Thomas maneuvered the conversation toward the topic of food quality in mining camps, praising Martha's cooking while subtly questioning the source of her superior ingredients. He mentioned his background as a butcher, establishing his credibility to recognize different types of meat, then carefully planted seeds of doubt about what they had actually been eating. Peter's response confirmed Thomas's assessment of his character. Instead of dismissing the implications or reacting with immediate horror, Peter asked pointed questions that demonstrated both his investigative experience and his willingness to consider unthinkable possibilities. The conversation continued over several nights, with Thomas gradually sharing more of his observations and Peter contributing insights from his own brief time at the boarding house. The partnership that developed between Thomas and Peter was necessarily covert. They communicated through seemingly casual interactions, shared information through coded references during group conversations, and coordinated their investigations to avoid arousing Martha's suspicions. Both men understood that they were dealing with someone who had successfully killed multiple times and would not hesitate to eliminate any threats to her operation. Peter's investigation of Martha's crimes was systematic and thorough. He began by examining the physical layout of the boarding house, noting details that might be relevant to disposing of bodies or concealing evidence. The root cellar was an obvious starting point, but Martha kept it locked and was always present when deliveries were made or supplies retrieved. The breakthrough came when Peter discovered that Martha maintained a strict schedule for her activities, leaving the boarding house at specific times each week for what she described as shopping trips to other settlements. These absences provided opportunities for thorough searches of areas that were normally off-limits, including her private quarters and the locked storage areas. Peter's first exploration of the root cellar exceeded his worst expectations. The carefully labeled packages of preserved meat, the detailed journals documenting each victim's physical characteristics and yield, and the collection of personal effects stolen from the dead men provided overwhelming evidence of Martha's crimes. But Peter was experienced enough to know that evidence alone would not be sufficient. In a community without formal law enforcement, he would need to expose Martha's crimes in a way that would result in immediate justice rather than allowing her to escape and continue her activities elsewhere. The plan that Peter and Thomas developed required precise timing and careful staging. They needed to catch Martha in the act of preparing human flesh for consumption, with witnesses present who could not deny what they were seeing. The opportunity came on March 15th, when Martha began preparing what appeared to be organ meat for that evening's dinner. Peter had been monitoring Martha's food preparation routine and recognized the distinctive appearance of human liver, which differed subtly from the organs of animals commonly used for food. More telling was Martha's behavior as she worked. The familiar efficiency of someone who had performed the same task many times before, combined with occasional references to techniques that were inappropriate for preparing animal organs. Instead of confronting Martha immediately, Peter waited until the other boarders had gathered for dinner before revealing what he had discovered. The timing was crucial. The men needed to see the evidence before Martha could dispose of it, but the revelation needed to occur when emotions were running high enough to prevent Martha from talking her way out of the situation. The scene that followed was chaotic and horrifying. Peter's announcement that Martha was preparing human organs for dinner was met with initial disbelief, then growing horror as he presented the evidence he and Thomas had gathered. The men who had been praising Martha's cooking for months suddenly understood what they had actually been consuming, and their reactions ranged from violent illness to murderous rage. Martha's response to being exposed was chilling in its calmness. She showed no shame or remorse for her crimes, instead explaining her actions with the detached rationality of someone discussing a business decision. The boarding house had been a perfect cover for her activities, she explained, providing both a steady supply of victims and customers who would consume the evidence while paying for the privilege. She had learned, Martha continued, that human flesh was not only nutritionally superior to other meat, but also more readily available than traditional livestock in frontier settlements. Her marriages had been business arrangements designed to provide a steady supply of high-quality protein while also acquiring the gold and personal effects of her victims. The elaborate courtships and wedding ceremonies had been necessary theater to maintain her reputation and avoid suspicion. The revelation that followed was even more disturbing. Martha produced a journal that documented not just her crimes in Deadwood Gulch, but a career of similar activities that had begun years earlier in other frontier settlements. She had perfected her techniques through experience, learning how to select victims, avoid suspicion, and maximize the yield from each body. Deadwood Gulch was simply the latest in a series of locations where she had operated. Martha's confession revealed the full scope of her crimes and the calculated nature of her cannibalistic enterprise. She had been operating as a serial killer for over a decade, moving from town to town throughout the frontier territories and leaving a trail of deaths that had been attributed to the harsh conditions of frontier life. Her technique had been refined through experience, and she had developed what amounted to a systematic approach to murder and body disposal. The massive iron cooking pot that had been the centerpiece of her kitchen was revealed to be a carefully designed tool for her crimes. She had commissioned it from a blacksmith in Illinois, specifying dimensions and features that would make it ideal for processing human bodies. The pot's size allowed her to cook entire torsos at once, while its heavy construction retained heat efficiently and masked any unusual odors that might attract attention. Martha explained her methods with the pride of a craftsman discussing their trade. The pot's design included special drainage features that allowed her to separate rendered fat from cooking meat, creating lard that she used for other cooking purposes while ensuring that nothing was wasted. The iron's thickness prevented scorching during the long, slow cooking process that was necessary to properly tenderize human flesh, while the pot's capacity allowed her to prepare enough meat to feed the boarding house for weeks from a single victim. Her knowledge of butchering and food preservation had been acquired through apprenticeships with legitimate tradesmen, but she had adapted their techniques for her own purposes. She could break down a human body with surgical precision, separating different cuts according to their intended use and preserving each portion using methods appropriate to its texture and fat content. Her understanding of anatomy allowed her to maximize the yield from each victim while minimizing the waste that might attract scavengers or create suspicious odors. Martha's recipes had been developed through years of experimentation, finding ways to disguise the distinctive flavor of human flesh and make it appealing to unsuspecting diners. She had learned which spices and cooking methods could mask the slightly sweet taste that distinguished human meat from other proteins, and how to combine different cuts to create textures that seemed familiar to people accustomed to beef or pork. The boarding house's isolation had been crucial to her success. The nearest settlement was over a day's ride away, making it unlikely that authorities would investigate deaths thoroughly or quickly. The transient nature of the mining community meant that disappearances were common and rarely questioned, and the harsh conditions of frontier life provided plausible explanations for deaths that might have seemed suspicious in more civilized areas. Martha had also benefited from the limited medical knowledge available in frontier communities. Dr. Mills, like most frontier physicians, had minimal training and relied primarily on experience and folk remedies. His diagnoses were based on symptoms rather than detailed examinations, and he rarely questioned deaths that seemed consistent with common frontier ailments. Martha had studied these patterns and learned to induce symptoms that would lead to predictable diagnoses. The psychological aspect of Martha's crimes was perhaps the most disturbing element of her confession. She described her victims with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating livestock, noting their physical condition, estimated weight, and potential yield of usable meat. Her journals contained detailed profiles of each man's personality, habits, and weaknesses, information she had used to manipulate them into trusting her completely. Martha's selection criteria had evolved over time as she gained experience in identifying ideal victims. She preferred men who were physically robust but socially isolated, with substantial financial assets but no strong family connections. These characteristics ensured that her victims would provide maximum benefit while minimizing the risk of outside investigation into their disappearances. The courtship process had been carefully designed to serve multiple purposes. It allowed Martha to assess each victim's financial situation and personal history, identifying any potential complications that might arise after their death. It also provided opportunities to isolate the men from other community members, making them dependent on Martha for companionship and emotional support. Finally, the marriage ceremony itself served as a kind of ritual that marked the transition from courtship to the final phase of victimization. Martha's explanation of her preservation techniques revealed a level of sophistication that bordered on the professional. She had developed methods for curing different cuts of meat that maximized their shelf life and flavor, allowing her to consume a single victim over several months while maintaining the quality of the meat. Her root cellar had been designed with temperature and humidity controls that created optimal storage conditions, and she had invested in equipment that allowed her to package and label her products with the precision of a commercial operation. The financial aspect of Martha's crimes had been equally calculated. In addition to the meat that fed her boarding house customers, she had been profiting from the gold and personal effects stolen from her victims. She had developed relationships with dishonest merchants in distant settlements who would purchase jewelry and precious metals without asking questions about their source. The steady income from these sales had allowed her to maintain the boarding house's operations and fund her movements between different territories. Peter's military experience proved invaluable in documenting the full extent of Martha's crimes. He understood the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining clear records that could be used in any future legal proceedings. Working with Thomas, he began a systematic cataloging of everything they had discovered, creating an inventory that would serve as the foundation for prosecution. The physical evidence was overwhelming in both quantity and detail. Martha's journals contained not only records of her crimes in Deadwood Gulch, but detailed accounts of similar activities in at least 6 other frontier settlements over the previous decade. Each entry included the victim's name, physical description, financial assets, and the circumstances of their death, along with technical notes about butchering yields and meat quality. The preserved remains in the root cellar told their own story. Peter's examination revealed that Martha had been processing bodies with the efficiency of a professional butcher, utilizing virtually every portion of each victim. The labeling system she had developed indicated not only which victim each package came from, but also the date of processing and the intended use for each cut. More disturbing were the personal effects that Martha had kept as trophies. Wedding rings, pocket watches, gold nuggets, and important documents had been carefully preserved and catalogued, creating a macabre museum of her victims' lives. Some items bore inscriptions that revealed heartbreaking details about the men's families and dreams, making their deaths seem even more tragic. Peter also discovered evidence of Martha's connections to criminal networks in other territories. Letters and financial records indicated that she had been working with accomplices who helped her establish new identities and operations in different locations. These partnerships suggested that Martha's crimes were part of a larger pattern of organized criminal activity that had been operating across the frontier for years. The investigation revealed that Martha had been using multiple names and identities, making it difficult to track her movements or connect her to crimes in different locations. She had developed sophisticated methods for creating false documents and establishing credible backgrounds that would satisfy the limited record-keeping systems used in frontier communities. Thomas's expertise as a former butcher proved crucial in understanding the technical aspects of Martha's crimes. He was able to explain to the other boarders exactly how human flesh differed from animal meat, and why Martha's cooking methods had been so effective in disguising what they were actually eating. His testimony would later be essential in convincing skeptical community members that the accusations against Martha were based on factual evidence rather than hysteria or prejudice. The psychological impact on the boarding house residents was severe and immediate. Men who had been praising Martha's cooking for months suddenly understood that they had been unknowingly participating in cannibalism, and the realization produced reactions ranging from violent illness to complete psychological breakdown. Several boarders required medical attention for symptoms that Dr. Mills attributed to extreme shock and trauma. The community's response to the revelations was complicated by the lack of precedent for dealing with crimes of this magnitude. Deadwood Gulch had no established legal system, no jail facilities, and no experience with formal criminal proceedings. The residents were forced to create their own methods for investigating the accusations against Martha and determining an appropriate response. As word of the accusations against Martha spread throughout Deadwood Gulch, the community's response grew increasingly volatile. Men who had been customers at the boarding house demanded to know exactly what they had been eating, while others refused to believe that such crimes were possible. The lack of formal authority meant that mob justice became a real possibility, with some community members calling for Martha's immediate execution without any form of trial. Martha herself remained remarkably calm throughout the growing chaos. She continued to operate the boarding house as if nothing had changed, preparing meals and maintaining her normal routines even as evidence of her crimes was being displayed for increasingly horrified audiences. Her behavior suggested either complete confidence in her ability to escape consequences or a form of psychological detachment that allowed her to ignore the reality of her situation. Peter recognized that the community's emotional state was becoming dangerous for everyone involved. Without careful management, the situation could deteriorate into vigilante violence that might result in additional deaths and would certainly prevent any systematic investigation of Martha's crimes. He began organizing the more level-headed community members into a structure that could provide due process while ensuring that justice would be served. The evidence continued to accumulate as more people came forward with observations about Martha's behavior that had seemed innocent at the time, but now appeared sinister. Miners reported seeing Martha disposing of large bundles in remote locations, while merchants recalled her unusual requests for specific types of equipment and supplies. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of someone who had been methodically planning and executing murders for months. Dr. Mills's involvement in the investigation added medical credibility to the accusations against Martha. His examination of the preserved remains confirmed that they were human, and his review of the deaths he had attributed to natural causes revealed suspicious patterns that he had missed at the time. His testimony would be crucial in establishing that Martha's victims had been murdered rather than dying from the diseases he had diagnosed. The discovery of Martha's correspondence with accomplices in other territories expanded the investigation beyond Deadwood Gulch. Letters found in her possession indicated that she had been part of a network of criminals operating throughout the frontier, sharing information about potential targets and profitable locations. This revelation suggested that similar crimes might be occurring in other settlements, and that Martha's arrest could lead to the exposure of a much larger criminal conspiracy. Martha's final attempt to maintain her innocence came in the form of alternative explanations for the evidence against her. She claimed that the preserved meat in her root cellar came from legitimate sources, and that the personal effects belonged to boarders who had left items behind when they departed. Her journals, she insisted, were works of fiction rather than records of actual crimes. These explanations were undermined by the technical expertise that Thomas and Peter brought to analyzing the evidence. Thomas's knowledge of meat processing made it impossible for Martha to claim that human flesh was actually animal protein, while Peter's investigative experience allowed him to identify inconsistencies in her alternative narratives. The revelation of Martha's crimes created a crisis of trust within Deadwood Gulch that went far beyond the immediate horror of cannibalism and murder. Community members began questioning everything they thought they knew about their neighbors, wondering who else might be hiding dark secrets behind facades of respectability. The social bonds that held the settlement together were strained to the breaking point as people struggled to process the implications of what had been happening in their midst. The economic impact was immediate and severe. The boarding house had been the center of the community's social and economic life, providing not only meals and lodging, but also serving as a meeting place where business was conducted and information was exchanged. With Martha's crimes exposed and the building contaminated by association with cannibalism, the settlement faced the loss of its most important institution. Several families made immediate preparations to leave Deadwood Gulch, unwilling to remain in a place where such horrors had occurred. The exodus was accelerated by fears that Martha might have accomplices who were still operating in the area, or that other criminals might be attracted to a community that had proven vulnerable to such exploitation. The minors who had been customers at the boarding house faced particular psychological trauma. The realization that they had been unknowingly consuming human flesh produced symptoms ranging from persistent nausea to complete inability to eat solid food. Dr. Mills found himself treating patients for conditions he had never encountered before, as grown men struggled with the knowledge that they had been unwilling participants in cannibalism. The investigation also revealed the extent to which Martha had manipulated the entire community. Her reputation as an excellent cook and successful businesswoman had been built on the consumption of murder victims, while her apparent grief at losing multiple husbands had been a calculated performance designed to deflect suspicion. The discovery that so many community members had been deceived by someone they had trusted and admired created lasting damage to their ability to trust their own judgment. Religious leaders in the community struggled to provide guidance for dealing with crimes that seemed to exist outside the normal framework of sin and redemption. Circuit Preacher Williams, who had performed Martha's multiple wedding ceremonies, was particularly affected by the revelation that he had been unknowingly facilitating her selection of victims. His sermons in the weeks following Martha's exposure focused on themes of evil disguising itself as good, and the difficulty of recognizing true nature beneath convincing appearances. The practical challenges of dealing with Martha's crimes were as complex as the emotional ones. The boarding house contained evidence that needed to be preserved for any legal proceedings, but the building was also contaminated with human remains and could not continue to function as a residence or business. The massive iron pot that had been used to cook the victims presented particular problems, as its size and symbolic significance made it impossible to ignore, but too horrifying to keep. The decision to hold a formal trial was controversial within the community, with many residents preferring immediate execution to what they saw as unnecessary delays in delivering justice. However, Peter's arguments about the importance of establishing precedent and documenting Martha's crimes for the protection of other communities eventually prevailed. The trial would also provide an opportunity to expose any accomplices and gather information about criminal networks operating in other territories. Circuit Preacher Williams agreed to serve as judge, despite his obvious conflict of interest, as someone who had been manipulated by Martha's crimes. His theological training provided some background in moral reasoning and dispute resolution, making him the closest thing to a qualified legal authority available in the settlement. The selection of a jury from adult male community members followed established territorial precedents, though the emotional involvement of potential jurors in the case created obvious challenges for maintaining objectivity. Peter took responsibility for organizing the prosecution's case, drawing on his military and investigative experience to present evidence in a systematic and convincing manner. His approach focused on establishing a clear timeline of Martha's crimes, demonstrating the consistency of her methods and providing technical evidence that would make denial impossible. The physical evidence was supplemented by testimony from community members who had observed suspicious behavior but had not understood its significance at the time. Thomas Brennigan's role as the primary witness was crucial to the prosecution's case. His expertise as a former butcher gave him unique credibility in identifying human flesh and explaining Martha's processing techniques. His testimony about the months of growing suspicion and investigation that had led to the discovery of the crimes provided context for understanding how Martha had been able to operate undetected for so long. The preparation of evidence required careful handling of materials that were both legally important and physically revolting. The preserved remains from Martha's root cellar needed to be documented and displayed in ways that would convince skeptical jurors while not creating additional trauma for people who were already struggling with the psychological impact of the revelations. Martha's own journals provided the most damning evidence against her, but they also created ethical dilemmas about how much detail should be shared with the community. The technical descriptions of butchering techniques and recipes were necessary to establish the scope of her crimes, but they also contained information that could potentially be used by other criminals to commit similar offenses. The defense of Martha presented unique challenges. as no one in the community was willing to argue for her innocence in the face of overwhelming evidence. Instead, the focus shifted to questions about her mental state and whether someone capable of such crimes could be held fully responsible for their actions. These arguments were complicated by Martha's obvious intelligence and careful planning, which made claims of insanity difficult to support. The trial of Martha Sinclair began on March 26th and lasted for 5 days, making it the longest and most complex legal proceeding in the history of Deadwood Gulch. The proceedings were held in the community's only large building, a warehouse that had been converted into a makeshift courtroom with benches arranged to accommodate the entire adult population of the settlement. Peter's opening statement established the prosecution's case with military precision, outlining the charges against Martha and previewing the evidence that would be presented. He emphasized the systematic nature of her crimes and the calculating intelligence that had allowed her to operate undetected for so long. His presentation was designed to counter any sympathy Martha might generate by demonstrating that her actions had been the result of careful planning rather than temporary insanity or desperation. The first day of testimony focused on establishing the timeline of events and the pattern of Martha's marriages and the subsequent deaths of her husbands. Witnesses described the circumstances of each man's arrival at the boarding house, the rapid progression of his courtship and marriage to Martha, and the suspicious nature of his death shortly afterward. The consistency of these accounts made it impossible to dismiss the deaths as coincidental. Thomas Brennigan's testimony occupied most of the second day and provided the technical foundation for the prosecution's case. He explained his background as a butcher and his growing suspicions about the meat being served at the boarding house. His description of the differences between human and animal flesh was detailed enough to convince even skeptical jurors, while his account of discovering the preserved remains in Martha's root cellar provided dramatic evidence of her crimes. The third day featured testimony from other community members who had observed Martha's behavior and noticed details that had seemed innocent at the time, but now appeared sinister. Dr. Mills described the pattern of deaths he had attributed to natural causes, acknowledging his failure to recognize the suspicious nature of the symptoms and timing. His testimony added medical credibility to the accusations, while also revealing how Martha had exploited the limited diagnostic capabilities available in frontier communities. Peter's presentation of Martha's journals and other documentary evidence occupied the fourth day of the trial. The detailed records of her crimes, including technical notes about butchering techniques and victim selection criteria, provided overwhelming proof of her guilt, while also revealing the scope of her activities in other territories. The reading of specific entries created visible distress among jurors and spectators, but it was necessary to establish the full extent of her criminal enterprise. Martha's decision not to provide any defense testimony was controversial, but ultimately irrelevant, given the strength of the evidence against her. Her calm demeanor throughout the proceedings suggested either complete acceptance of her fate or confidence that she could escape consequences even if convicted. She showed no emotional response to the testimony describing her victim's suffering or the impact of her crimes on the community. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized the unprecedented nature of Martha's crimes and the need for decisive action to prevent similar incidents in the future. Peter argued that the systematic nature of her murders and the cannibalistic disposal of her victims' bodies represented a form of evil that required the strongest possible response from the community. He also stressed the importance of documenting the case thoroughly to warn other settlements about the possibility of similar crimes. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 2 hours, reflecting the overwhelming nature of the evidence against Martha and the community's unanimous revulsion at her crimes. The foreman's announcement of a guilty verdict on all charges was met with a mixture of relief and continued horror, as community members struggled to process the confirmation of events that seemed almost too terrible to believe. The sentencing phase of the trial provided an opportunity for community members to express their feelings about Martha's crimes and their impact on the settlement. Several people spoke about the psychological trauma of learning they had been unknowingly consuming human flesh, while others described the destruction of trust and security that Martha's actions had created. The emotional testimony provided context for understanding why the community felt that the death penalty was the only appropriate response. Circuit Preacher Williams's sentencing statement reflected the theological and moral complexity of dealing with crimes that seem to exist outside normal frameworks of sin and redemption. He struggled to find religious precedents for Martha's actions while acknowledging that her calculated evil required decisive earthly justice. His announcement that Martha would be executed by hanging was met with solemn approval from the assembled community. Martha's response to her death sentence was consistent with her behavior throughout the trial. She showed no emotional reaction to the announcement and made no plea for mercy or expression of remorse. Her only request was that her cooking pot be destroyed to prevent anyone else from using it for similar purposes, a suggestion that was readily accepted by the court. The scheduling of Martha's execution for the following dawn reflected the community's desire to end the traumatic proceedings as quickly as possible. The speed of the sentence also served practical purposes, as keeping Martha alive for an extended period would have required security arrangements that the settlement was not equipped to provide. There was also concern that delay might allow accomplices to attempt a rescue or create additional complications for the community. Martha Sinclair was executed at dawn on March 31, 1855, in a ceremony attended by virtually everyone in Deadwood Gulch. The hanging was conducted with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances, reflecting the community's desire to end Martha's crimes without descending to her level of brutality. Circuit Preacher Williams performed a brief service that focused on themes of justice and the protection of the innocent rather than forgiveness or redemption. Martha's final words were brief and unrepentant. She expressed no remorse for her crimes and offered no apologies to her victims' families or the community she had deceived. Instead, she used her last moments to warn that others like her existed throughout the frontier territories, taking advantage of isolation and lawlessness to commit crimes that would be impossible in more civilized areas. Her final statement was a chilling reminder that her death would not necessarily end the threat of similar crimes in other communities. The destruction of Martha's cooking pot required special arrangements due to its size and symbolic significance. The massive iron vessel was broken apart using sledgehammers and cold chisels, with the pieces scattered in different locations throughout the territory to ensure it could never be reassembled. The destruction was witnessed by community members who wanted to ensure that this tool of Martha's crimes could never be used again. The boarding house was systematically dismantled and burned, with every piece of wood, furniture, and equipment reduced to ash. The root cellar where Martha had stored her victims' remains was filled with rocks and dirt, sealing away any traces of her crimes. The destruction was so thorough that within days, only the foundation stones remained to mark where the building had stood. The psychological impact of Martha's crimes continued to affect the community long after her execution. Several families left Deadwood Gulch immediately after the trial, unable to remain in a place where such horrors had occurred. Those who stayed struggled with persistent anxiety about the possibility that other criminals might be operating in their midst, and social relationships were strained by the knowledge that someone they had trusted completely had been capable of such monstrous acts. Dr. Mills filed detailed reports with territorial medical authorities describing the pattern of deaths he had failed to recognize and the techniques Martha had used to avoid detection. His documentation led to new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths in frontier communities and increased training for medical personnel working in isolated areas. His experience also contributed to improved communication systems between settlements that would make it more difficult for criminals like Martha to operate undetected. The abandonment of Deadwood Gulch began within weeks of Martha's execution and was completed within 6 months. The discovery of her crimes had destroyed the community's sense of security and trust, making it impossible for people to live and work together normally. The economic disruption caused by the loss of the boarding house and the exodus of families created a downward spiral that made the settlement unsustainable. Thomas Brennigan's detailed account of Martha's crimes was preserved in territorial archives and became an important resource for law enforcement officials dealing with similar cases. His documentation of the investigation techniques that had exposed Martha's activities provided valuable guidance for future criminal investigations in frontier communities. After completing his report, Thomas left for California, where he lived quietly as a farmer until his death in 1889. Peter Larson parlayed his experience with the Martha Sinclair case into a career as a territorial marshal, specializing in investigating suspicious deaths and unusual criminal activity in frontier settlements. His systematic approach to criminal investigation and his understanding of the challenges posed by isolation and limited resources made him particularly effective in environments where traditional law enforcement methods were inadequate. The Martha Sinclair case became a cautionary tale that spread throughout the frontier territories, warning communities about the possibility that seemingly respectable citizens might be concealing dark secrets. The story served as a reminder that the isolation and lawlessness of frontier life could enable crimes that would be impossible in more civilized areas, and that vigilance was necessary to protect vulnerable communities from predators. Modern historians and criminologists who have studied the case consider it one of the earliest documented examples of organized serial killing in American history. Martha's systematic approach to victim selection, murder, and body disposal demonstrated a level of planning and sophistication that was unusual for the time period. Her ability to operate successfully for over a decade suggests that many similar crimes may have gone undetected in other frontier communities. The psychological profile of Martha Sinclair continues to fascinate researchers studying the development of criminal behavior in American history. Her combination of intelligence, careful planning, and complete lack of empathy for her victims represents characteristics that would later be associated with psychopathic personality disorders. Her practical approach to cannibalism, treating it as a business opportunity rather than a compulsion, sets her apart from other documented cases of the period. The location of the former Deadwood Gulch settlement remains largely undisturbed today, marked only by scattered foundation stones and the filled depression where Martha's root cellar once stood. The area has returned to wilderness, with no visible signs of the thriving mining community that once existed there. Local historians have occasionally suggested placing a memorial marker at the site, but these proposals have been consistently rejected by community members who prefer to let the location remain forgotten. The discovery of Martha's cooking pot in 1967 provided dramatic confirmation of the historical accounts of her crimes. A construction crew building a Forest Service road uncovered the buried pot, exactly where territorial records indicated it had been placed. The massive iron vessel still contained bone fragments and other material that confirmed its use in Martha's cannibalistic activities, even after more than a century underground. The coroner who examined the contents of the recovered pot confirmed that the bone fragments were human, but declined to issue an official report about the discovery. The find was considered too disturbing for public discussion, and all records of the recovery were sealed. The pot was reburied in an undisclosed location, ensuring that this artifact of Martha's crimes would remain hidden from public view. Researchers who have attempted to locate other sites associated with Martha's criminal activities have been frustrated by the limited records available from frontier communities of the 1840s and 1850s. Many settlements from that period have disappeared entirely, taking with them any evidence of crimes that may have occurred there. The possibility that Martha's activities were part of a larger network of criminal activity remains tantalizing but unproven. The case continues to influence modern criminal investigations and law enforcement training. Martha's techniques for avoiding detection and exploiting the limitations of frontier justice systems provide valuable insights into how criminals adapt to different environments and social conditions. Her case is frequently cited in discussions about the challenges of investigating crimes in isolated communities with limited resources and infrastructure. This mystery shows us how even in America's earliest days, evil could flourish in the shadows of isolation and desperation, hidden behind the mask of hospitality and domesticity. Martha Sinclair's crimes remind us that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most trustworthy, and that vigilance is the price of safety in any community. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or might there be more victims we'll never know about? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.